Hello, it's Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter here. Now, I'm making a quilt for myself and I'm calling it the NHS Memory Quilt. I'm using former uniforms and scrubs and then using fabric from my stash and yardage. I'm going to cut it into jelly roll strips and then create a design. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I make the topper. Come into the kitchen with me and I'll show where to begin. In the trousers, this is just one leg. So at the narrowest point, they measure 21 inches and probably about 38 inches across the widest point at the hip. Because I'm recycling fabrics and I've taken garments apart, the length of the jelly roll is going to be determined by the longest length then of the garment that I can recover. For this, it's the back section on the uniform. And I've got two smaller pieces that I'll cut into if necessary. I'm not concerned about creases. I think it adds to the interest. They've been there for 35 years. If I was making this garment for somebody else, I might try to avoid that. From the dress, I've opened out the hemlines of the frill. This was not cut on the bias and it's ideal because it's 8.5 inches. I'll be able to get 3 jelly roll strips out of that widthwise, and it's quite a good length. I've got 2 of those. From the other dress, I've taken 2 long front pieces and I've made sure that it wasn't cut on the bias. I want to cut on the length and the width of the cloth. The other thing about this, it's embroidery on glaze, and actually this was the front of the garment. I'm going to use the wrong side because I want the white to show up. That's my choice. Can you see the difference there? I'm going to use my dumbbell to hold the acrylic ruler in place and use my rotary cutter. First, I need a good straight edge, and then I'm going to use the 2.5 inch cutter on my rule to cut jelly roll strips equivalent. When I'm recycling, I never know how much of the fabric I'm going to use. What I try to do is ensure that I've got more that I can return to if I need it. I'm now taking my jelly roll strips and placing them in the order that they're going to fall throughout the quilt. I have my navy in the middle, then I have 2 florals, and then the plains on the lighter edge. I photographed this and tested it in grayscale so you can see that there's a considerable difference in tonal value between the middle and the outer edges. I'm going to sew them together, starting from the top with a 1/4 inch seam. Remember that I want the right side to be the white of the brocade showing. This is actually the wrong side of the fabric, and on the plain fabrics you can't tell which is the right and which is the wrong side of the fabric, but I would say if you have patterned fabric, you're sewing right sides together throughout. I'm sewing at one end of my kitchen table, and I'm going to be sewing this on my Singer Heavy Duty 4332 machine, and I'm just going to go through the basics before I begin. I've previously been quilting, so I've made sure that I've cleaned all the lint out. I took out the screws and removed this top plate and cleaned out with a soft brush, and this is the lint that I got from the inside. That's always worth doing. Otherwise that can clog up your machine. Now I have changed my needle, and this is the one that's going to go in the sharps bin. So my needle is a 9014 Singer sewing needle. I'm going to use a Silco 50 weight thread. This is a powder blue, colour number 50. And I'm going to use the same in the top and in the bobbin. Now my needle position is in the right, and I've tested that so it lands on my midline on my hemline sewing tape, which means that when I butt up against this line or this little magnetic aid, I'll get 1/4 inch. And my quilt is going to use 1/4 inch seams throughout. I've changed from a quilting foot back to a presser foot. My tension is set on 4. My needle position is to the right. My width is 5.5, and I'm going to alter my stitch length down to 2 because I'm going to be cutting into these stitches, and my stitch selection is a straight stitch. Together, there's no need to pin. Just make sure you've got your raw edges aligned. There's no need to do a back stitch at either end either, because we're going to be cutting those ends off. Now iron the strips so that the seams fall in one direction. Now fold them over so that strips 1 and 5 meet right sides together. I'm going to sew down the outside edge to create a tube. I'm just going to cut off that raw edge, and I'm going to cut 2.5 inch strips here, and I'm going to cut 80 of those. Each block is going to take 5 pieces of this tube. I'm going to start unpicking some seams, and I'm going to unpick this seam, then this seam, then this seam, then this seam, and then this seam. Now, when you open them out, iron them flat. Here, my dominant colour is the navy, so I've arranged them so that the dominant forms a diagonal across the block. I'm going to sew them together at seams and pin them together, making sure that you've nested your seams. Now there's 4 pieces of fabric there. I'm going to change on my sewing machine to a walking foot so that it doesn't jump over those thick pieces. This is more important when you're using uniforms that might be thicker than the fabric that you've added to it. I pin all 5 rows and take them to the machine like this. With the walking foot in place, maintain the 1/4 inch seam, but you want to do a reverse stitch at the beginning and the end of this sewing line. The finished block then looks like this. I need 16 of these. Now I've brought this to my bed to create the layout, and you can see that the dark navy creates the diamond pattern. So there are central squares that are dark, then light, then dark, and you've got diamonds of one colour and then diamonds of a floral, and this will create interest around the quilt. I'm going to now sew them together. I've marked them, the rows. I'm going to sew row 1 across, and then 2, 3, 4, and then I'm going to add row 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. And it's also worth testing your pattern in grayscale, so let's do that. That's the patchwork completed. It's now 40 inch square and I've ironed it. I'm going to add white fabric to the sides, and then I'm going to elongate it top and bottom to make it more of a throw size. To represent the white uniforms that I wore, I'm going to use cotton, and I'm taking the cotton from a Dunelm double quilt set, and I've unpicked, and I'm going to use the length of a pillowcase, and then I'll use the same fabric as my backing. This, instead of £30, it cost me £21, and it's a really good cheap source of really good quality white cotton. Each pillowcase measures 20 by 68 inches. So I'm going to cut 4 5-inch borders down the length. So I'm adding to the sides first, so I need 2 pieces that are 5 inches by 40 inches. Please note that I haven't changed the colour of my cotton thread or in the bobbin, and I'm still maintaining 1/4-inch seams throughout. And then as we add an extra border at the top and the bottom, we need an extra 5 inches. So this top and the bottom piece are 5 inches by 50 inches. Now I've joined some jelly roll strips together, and I'm going to add them right sides together at the top and the bottom of the white layer. To represent the Petersham belt that I wore, I'm going to use this gross grain ribbon. It's 38mm wide. It's in navy. It's like a French navy. And to sew it on, I'm using a Silco thread. This is from my vintage thread gallery, and this colour is dark sapphire. This, as you can see, was purchased in Woolworths years ago. It's a 40 cotton, mercerised cotton thread, and it's still held its colour all these years later. It's probably from the 1980s, which is appropriate for me for this memory quilt. I'll use the same thread in the top and in the bobbin. I'm not changing my needle. Remember, I've got a 90-14 in here. When you're sewing something that is tough, you need a tough thread. So a 40 weight thread is stronger than a 50 weight thread. I'm going through something tough, and I'm going through more layers. So I'm not altering the rest of my settings, but I am going to alter my stitch length. And I'm going to change it from a 2 to... Oh, sorry. I'm going to change it from a 2 to a 2.5. As this is a throw size blanket, I'm going to place this ribbon where it will sit more or less around waist height. So I'm just doing it and placing it and pinning it midway between the first jelly roll strip, and I'm making sure that I'm at the top of the quilt and won't be repeating this at the bottom. And I'm going to sew 2 lines of stitching to secure it on here and here. Now I'm just going to iron it and square it up. You can see that I've laid my easy rule. My 2-inch is here, so you can see when I cut I can get a good 4.5-inch border all the way around, and that will square my corners too. I made a mistake with the design and had to go back and replace one block. I'd sewed it in the wrong way up, and that was the top row, the second block in. I'll show it you in grayscale and see if you can see, if you would spot it and see how to correct it. So here's my finished topper. It's a bit of a change from uniforms, isn't it? It now measures 49 inches across and 61 inches down. I'll be quilting it myself at home on the same domestic sewing machine. Why don't you come back and join me to see how I complete this? Meanwhile, don't forget to like, subscribe so that you don't miss anything, and I'll see you soon. This is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter. Bye.